Brown v. Board of Education was a hard-won U.S. Supreme Court case which declared segregated public schools unconstitutional, but the struggle began many years before. Post-Civil War America was a time of great change, though none was greater than the abolishment of slavery and the freeing of some 4 million slaves through the 13th Amendment. The 5 years following granted former slaves citizenship and voting rights, with the ratification of the 14th and 15th Amendments respectively. The following years continued to be hard for people of color, primarily in the southern states where the white populace was not soon to forget the Civil War. Some were actually still fighting it in their own way. One of those ways was by keeping the black population oppressed and segregated through Jim Crow laws. Although many felt these laws to be unjust, it wasn't until 1882 that they were formally tested. A 30-year-old African-American man by the name of Homer Plessy knowingly sat in the whites-only section of a train in New Orleans. This was against Louisiana state law, and he was arrested. Plessy fought his arrest on the grounds it violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, and by 1896 the case made it to the United States Supreme Court. In an 8-1 decision against Plessy, it stated that separate facilities for blacks and for whites were constitutional as long as they were equal. Many people and organizations continued the fight to put an end to these discriminatory laws, but none fought harder than the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP. Founded in 1909, the NAACP would not get much traction until 1935. During this time, its legal branch, headed by Charles Hamilton Houston and aided by a young Thurgood Marshall, cleverly started testing these laws by going after higher education. They correctly surmised it would be too costly for states to build separate but equal universities. The victories achieved through many of these cases gave the NAACP a new focus: segregation in public schools. By the 1950s, there were 5 separate NAACP cases in the state courts challenging the segregation of elementary schools. These cases, originating in Kansas, South Carolina, Delaware, Virginia, and the District of Columbia, were important as it showed segregation in public schools to be a national problem and not just a southern one. In June 1952, the U.S. Supreme Court announced it would hear oral arguments in 2 of these cases during the upcoming October 1952 term. However, before arguments could be heard, the court decided to bundle all 5 cases into one named after the Kansas case, Brown v. Board of Education. Oral arguments began December 1952. On December 9th, the plaintiff's lead counsel, Thurgood Marshall, began arguing the case. Unfortunately, his and his co-counselors' arguments were almost solely based on sociology as opposed to being based on law. One of the more well-known arguments was based on what is now known as the doll experiments. In 1939, husband and wife psychologists Drs. Kenneth and Mamie Clark had conducted the Clark doll experiments as part of Mrs. Clark's master's degree paper. During the experiment, African-American children between the ages of 6 and 9 were shown 2 dolls, one white and one black. They were then asked a series of questions, including which doll looks nice, which doll is bad, and which doll do you like the best. The majority of the children preferred the white doll. Marshall argued the damaging effects of segregation to African American children, shown by the doll experiments and the testimony of over 30 social scientists, was enough to prove that separate but equal had no place in public education. The defense's counsel, John W. Davis, was by all accounts a brilliant lawyer. Thurgood Marshall himself would skip classes at Howard University Law School to watch him ply his trade. Davis was also against segregation. As Solicitor General, he had persuaded the Supreme Court to strike down Oklahoma's voting statute that limited black voting. This happened to be the first time the NAACP entered a Supreme Court case by filing a friend of the court brief in support of Davis's position. Now, at 79 years old, he was in full command of the law and made short work of Marshall's argument. After highlighting for the court the fact that there was little legal argument to address in Marshall's presentation, he turned his attention to the doll experiments. In his argument, he cited the evidence shown in the doll experiments did not support Marshall's argument. In fact, the evidence contradicted it. The study showed a larger percentage of African American children from northern desegregated states, as opposed to African American children from southern states, preferred the white doll over the black doll. Davis therefore argued this could not be construed as evidence of a detrimental effect of segregation in public schools. Final arguments took place on December 11th. On Saturday, December 13th, the 9 justices met in the Supreme Court conference room to deliberate the case. Chief Justice Frederick M. Vinson opened the meeting. Although segregation had no supporters in the Supreme Court, he felt Marshall's argument was not enough to overturn separate but equal. He also knew they would need a unanimous vote for the case to have any legitimacy. Each justice spoke in turn based on seniority. Although each judge abhorred segregation in public schools, and as a practice itself, all but 3 justices felt Marshall's argument was too weak to overturn constitutional law. It was decided to postpone the decision until a later date. Of the 3 justices who felt Marshall's argument was just, 1 would take it upon himself to change the minds of the 6 that didn't. Justice Felix Frankfurter, a known radical who helped form the ACLU, used the delay as an opportunity to convince his fellow justices of the elasticity of the language in the 14th Amendment. In June 1953, the court ordered a second round of arguments in Brown v. Board to be heard in October of that year. However, on September 8th, Chief Justice Vinson unexpectedly died of a heart attack. This vacancy was filled by President Eisenhower's appointee, California Governor Earl Warren, on September 30th. Unlike his predecessor, Warren saw his appointment as opportunity to right past wrongs, more than to interpret the law. Arguments were once again postponed. On December 7, 1953, the second round of arguments in Brown v. Board began. Essentially a reiteration of the 1952 arguments, the plaintiff's case still relied on sociology, and the defense's case was based on precedent. This was to be John Davis's last argument of his 140 cases in front of the Supreme Court. Final arguments concluded on December 9th. Once again, behind closed doors, but now with Chief Justice Warren at the helm, and with encouragement from Justice Frankfurter, a decision was finally made. On Monday, May 17, 1954, in a unanimous decision, segregation by law was deemed unconstitutional. Although many constitutional scholars felt the decision went against legal tradition by relying on sociology rather than precedent or established law, it was ultimately what America needed at the time, and would serve to be the impetus for the civil rights movement.